I was born in the slums to parents with too many mouths to feed. Half my siblings barely managed to get by, with the others passing away, then being thrown into paupers' graves, unmarked and forgotten by society. Despite the personal loss to my family, with few, if any, options for my future, I was sold at the market and led away from my parents. I never saw them again. They didn't do it out of a lack of care. It was done in hopes of a warm bed, food, and a roof over my head. The sale was done quickly. Before I knew it, I was taken to a home where I saw the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. She murmured to herself in a language I didn't recognize. I was taken into a room to be bathed, given a clean dress to wear, and warm, delicious food to eat. And even better, a chance to grow in peace. Nothing in this world was free, so I was trained to dance for a wealthy audience. Favor from them could improve our fortunes, and only the gods knew where we may end up. Some could become courtesans, professional dancers, or even the blessed few could marry up. I never believed I could reach so high. We were taught how to sing, to dance, to provide worthy conversation, and how to be around the elites. I grew to adulthood. My training took on a more intimate change, where I was taught to pleasure men and women. With my training complete, I knew my life was going to change considerably. I blossomed with feminine curves, and knew I'll be sent out to dance for the first time. I accompanied my owner in her litter, having the privilege of being able to sit with her, and felt uncomfortable as we traveled through the streets. I saw the populace for the first time since I was taken. They looked alien to me, and the pair of us held up perfumed fruits to our noses to limit the stench. After a while of traveling, we stopped in the district with many of the older temples of ancient gods, and there had always been whispers that these gods were different, wicked, darker in nature, and willing to kill, wanting blood in human sacrifice. The building had circular spirals, sank into the earth, and was made out of local stone, rather than the more expensive imported marble used for the grander temples. It was covered in moss, and I wondered why we had come here. She leaned down to tell me this was the temple of her patron goddess. I had never been permitted entrance into any temple previously. I was too poor, and with no worthy offerings. I noticed she always whispered her commands, and leaned down to bid her bodyguards and litter bearers to stop. We were assisted down. Once outside, I walked down the uneven steps, and we waited to be admitted. They spoke a word I didn't recognize, a code word for their mysteries. It was hidden, secretive, and even fewer knew about her, let alone could remember her name. The rich aroma of incense greeted me first, as a veiled priestess opened the wooden door that had no handle to the outside. Only someone inside could permit outsiders to enter. There was a faint blur from the amount of smoke in the air, and I was led down into the center, where the statue of the goddess stood, her face shrouded in the swirling smoke, yet her curvaceous body was exposed, and painted with symbols I did not recognize. There was a belt with golden discs around her waist, and a string of precious jewels hung around her full chest. Yet otherwise, her body was completely exposed. Her hands were outstretched, a long, ancient sword in her left hand, and a stone flower in her right. Her feet were covered with a variety of candles of different colors and shapes. I was worried the place would end up going up in flames. None of them seemed fazed by this possibility. The goddess' facial expression was one of neutrality. Her eyes were colorless and rimmed with kohl to highlight them, and her hair hung down past her waist. She was crowned with golden antlers, the tips ending high above her head. I couldn't move my gaze from her. Any movement of the fire caused the shadows to dance around the room, and I could have sworn I saw her eyes glow. Perhaps there were hidden jewels inside that would dance with the changing light. My mistress took the hands of one of the priestesses. They kissed each other on the cheek several times in a warm greeting, before their lips met intimately and broke apart, whispering words I could not understand to each other. Behind me was a soft, rhythmic, feminine chanting from voices I couldn't see. The priestess silently pulled my chin to face her. the outline of her body was hidden, with only her painted lips exposed. She studied my face, and I wondered what she was looking for. Without breaking her gaze from mine, she lifted a goblet from the altar, took a mouthful of the liquid, and drew me into a passionate kiss, pushing the liquid into my mouth. It tasted like liquid fire, and burned on the way down. I gasped, with the kiss broken and the liquid on my lips, only to have the remnants pushed into my mouth by a single finger of the priestess. Somehow, I found myself kneeling before the statue, gazing up at it, and I knew my fate would depend on her divine verdict. My head swam, and soon I passed out, and I could have sworn I heard her whisper the name my parents call me. One I cannot recall anymore. I woke later in the litter. I was being carried to my new home. The priestess's hand tenderly stroked my hair and comforted me when I tried to sit up. From then on, I became the property of the temple and the order. The next night I was taken to the baths, cleansed and oiled, the fabric soft, expensive, and with semi-transparent layers. My skirt gave the illusion of floating, while my chest was left bare. Oil was circled on my skin in patterns I didn't recognize, and a long, jeweled necklace hung low between my naked breasts. As they prepared me, my body awoke with caresses and intimate kisses. My eyes were lined with dark kohl, and my lips painted to highlight them. My hands were decorated with a variety of rings, my wrists circular bracelets, and chains of jewels that would drop down when I lifted my hands. A thin rope of small gold plates jingled as they were wrapped around my waist. Now ready for my performance, I was led into a litter, and this time only the priestess accompanied me. We traveled in silence, and my thoughts raced about what was to come. My mistress, no longer so, and thus I truly entered the service of the nameless goddess. I heard the sound of flutes, drums, and other musical items lost to time. I was led into a room filled with viewers on cushions, with oil lamps surrounding the stage. The walls were lined with dancers clad only in air and jewelry, in a variety of poses and movements, and I peeked out while the audience made their entry. There were many other wealthy patrons entering, men arriving with courtesans, or perhaps even their wives who wished to indulge. Small groups sat or reclined together, platters of fruit and wine between them. I could barely see the front row. The further back, I could only see their seated silhouettes as they watched me. Now ready, I brought my hand from my forehead, then my lips, and bowed deep to the audience as I had been instructed. My body instantly responded to the lure of the music. My hips swayed and my belly jingled. The world around me had a bright, buzzing sensation. I could feel my heart rate increase, and the sounds of approval from the crowd only enhanced the intensity of the dance. Until this point, I never had this effect on anybody. There was an abnormal smoke in the air, circling up in unnatural patterns that the candles nor the braziers couldn't flow. It came toward me, and I realized it was smoke being drawn to me from the open mouths of the oblivious viewers. It entered my nostrils and mouth. There was no pain nor any strange feelings. I wanted to step back, to stop, but the lure of the music was too strong. Once the drumming finally stopped, I nearly fainted. Before remembering my training, I raised my hand to my heart, then my lips, then my forehead, and steadily waved my hand outward while I bowed deep. I remember walking off the stage feeling drowsy. The priestess took my hand and guided me back, and wouldn't answer when I asked her what happened. It was never explained to me. Every performance would send me into ecstasy. I'd feel it through my body. We never took enough to hurt the viewers, just enough to where they would blame it on heavy alcohol or other indulgences. I never asked again why we did it, or how it was in service to the goddess. Strange, now I remember. I'd feel like I was floating as I spun, an eternal bliss, and continued to dance. The swirling mist of people's life forces entered inside me, through my open mouth and nostrils. It was invigorating. The viewers never realized what was happening to them. They would applaud and plead us for an encore, one we rarely gave them, to prevent us from taking too much. I would go back that night to the temple. The priestess would draw me into an intimate kiss, her arms around me, our bodies tightly pressed together, and their essence would be drawn out of me. Without pain, they would pass to her. When the final soul was removed, exhaustion hit me, and I would awaken the next day in my bed. I would dream of bodies together, the sounds of desire, and wondering how this all served her. The next weeks, no, months that followed, were a blur. Endless faces and parties. Every night I would go out and dance. I couldn't remember any of them. The dancing and harvesting became normal. I would go with the music, and there was no set dance routine. I would sway with suggestive poses that tested flexibility and grace, a promise of what could have come. My body would move in tune with the music. They became one. The longer their essence entered my body, the more I noticed I was being transformed. The first changes were small. I had more energy when I was awake. Physically, I noticed a change when I gazed down at my hands. My skin glowed slightly, and my eyesight was considerably better when the sun went down. I never went outside during the day anymore. I went out to perform on the night that changed my life. The audience waited eagerly. The crowd cried out and clapped with great enthusiasm. Some yelled out amorous things they desired to do, to me and to each other. I could see them better than I had in the past. There were some new faces, and others of travelers from well beyond the city. The energy of the crowd was electric, and their passion only encouraged me. Many times, the audience would be so taken in with desire, their bodies would become entwined together, kissing and bringing each other to their peak. I saw many in the shadows, yet a single figure stood out in the back row. Physically, there was nothing different about him compared to the other men, but instinctively, I knew he wasn't human. I stared up at him, nearly missing my cue to start the rhythmic dance, and jumped when the music started. I tapped my foot. The jewel plates jingled as my hips gave the illusion they started the drums. It didn't take long before the audience came under my sway, drawn in by the movement of my hips and the sway of the music. My highlighted eyes watched as all their life forces came toward me. All but one. Even in the dim light, I could see the outline of his eyes. The life forces swirled around me. My mouth opened and I took them in, feeling the rush as they went through me. My eyes flooded, and all but one. His eyes glowed like a cat's in the dark. Normally by now, the music would have come to a stop, and my dancing would have also. I couldn't stop, and nor did the music. I spun around, my hair circling me, and the lines of my skirt lifted. I couldn't stop, and soon I was unwilling to. I could feel the life force becoming more intense. It filled me, and in the blur, I could feel the life force becoming more intense. It filled me. I saw the audience slowly turning into dry husks of themselves. Their skeletons slumped in place, and finally, the music came to an abrupt stop. I fell back on the ground, gasping for breath. I lay on the floor, breathing heavily, the spell broken, and sat up to stare at the crowd. They were all dead. The viewers, the serving girls who brought wine and fruit to the guests, the barman, the musicians whose songs kept me going, the courtesans, and most surprising of all, the priestess. Even the power of her goddess was not enough to keep whatever magic this was at bay. Her sigils were burnt off, and her skeleton lay in her finery, still with only her mouth exposed. I shakily stood, still in the center of the stage, unsure where to go or what to do. Still seated remained one figure, completely untouched. His body still concealed in the dark, and I saw his eyes that glowed, watching me the inhuman man. "What do you want?" I called out. My voice echoed on the walls. He didn't answer. I could have sworn I saw him smirk before he disappeared in the blink of an eye, as though he had never been there. I didn't want to be accused of murder or unholy arts, even if, perhaps inadvertently, I was guilty. Frantically, I ran and looked outside. The temple guards stood waiting for us, and were too busy with their pauper's beer to worry yet. I closed the door silently, and knew I had to get back to the temple, where I could get advice and return to my place of safety. There was too much risk for me to walk through the streets in my current attire. The risk of being seen as a streetwalker was too great. I wrapped a lady's pallor around myself, so it concealed my hair, and walked out to one of the seated guards. He did not recognize me until I spoke. "We need to leave. Now. I must talk to the high priestess immediately," I pleaded with him. He looked at me skeptically, unwilling to listen to someone with a status barely above his own, and walked to look inside. I waited, the only thing I could do, and it felt like an eternity. When he returned, his weathered face had grown pale with fear, the dried husk of the priestess in his arms, and he placed her remains in the litter. It was stiff, difficult to hold, and I closed my eyes so I wouldn't have to look at it. The journey back felt longer. I agonized whether or not people on the streets could see the horror inside, but instead, they focused on their own lives. Once we reached the temple, her body was carried back inside by the bodyguard. We stood close to the goddess's statue, and wondered what would occur next. "What is the meaning of this?" The coarse, frustrated voice echoed loudly. Her indomitable form strode through, and I immediately bowed my head in respect. A heavily ringed hand lifted the priestess's veil, before roughly backhanding the guard, her rings leaving bloodied marks. "You fool! Why would you dare bring the corpse inside?" she demanded, and looked to me for an explanation. I don't know. I danced as always. There was a man and I couldn't stop. I think I took too much somehow. I looked to him for an explanation or assistance. This sent her into a rage. She reached up, sharply pulled his head down, and pulled open his mouth to reveal he had no tongue, a secret I did not know of. "He cannot tell us. None of them can. Who was he? Who was the man that you mentioned?" she demanded sharply, a far cry from the cold, regal woman I had previously encountered. "I don't know. He had glowing eyes and wasn't affected by the music," I stuttered, frightened, and she pinned me against the wall, her face barely an inch from me, her long fingernails dug deep into my skin, and there was a crazed look in her eyes. With surprising strength, she lifted me up onto my toes, and then held me up in the air. "What did he do?" "Nothing. He sat during the performance, didn't stop me from dancing until they were all dead. I couldn't stop. They died, and I didn't get any of their essence. He took it all." I couldn't think of a better name for it. I waited, stared down at her, and she lowered me down with a defeated look in her eye. "We cannot oppose him. We must do what is necessary. I cannot be the one who lets him in." She spun around and slapped me hard across the face, and then backhanded me with the rings. I fell back against the wall, my hands up on my cheeks, and I stared up at her, the cold leaving dark tear stains down my cheeks. I was too stunned to respond. The bodyguard and I had no choice but to leave, in disgrace, along with the innocent corpse of the priestess. The door slammed hard behind us, forever unwelcome. Without the protection of the temple, we were forsaken. We left her body in an alleyway. I spoke how she'd been kind to us in her dealings, and we placed a few flowers, or rather, rogue weeds that grew in the alleyway on her remains. Before abandoning it, we went to the local tavern seeking employment, food and shelter. He found work as a bouncer, and I tried to be a barmaid. However, I would fumble, not used to these sorts of requests. One day, the palace shifted, and my naked chest was exposed, marking me either as a dancer or a courtesan. The owner bid I start dancing, and I complied, fearful of being driven out onto the street. It was a far cry from the places I danced previously. The rough crowd, the same people from where I was born. I danced to their hollers. Some clapped and others jeered for me to remove it all. I still maintained the ability to take their essence. A gift, either from the unnamed goddess or the stranger. The tavern keeper was a surprisingly good man, doted on his wife and family, caring for his employees, and not depriving us of our earnings. Over time, it became a home for us. Anytime a patron became too handsy, they'll be sternly reminded not to touch, or they would receive broken bones as punishment. A few noblemen and some wealthy travelers desired for me to go home with them. I declined, finding a freedom that I never had within the temple, and an independence that I never believed I could have. My dancing continued. It followed the more earthy dances of the local populace, rather than the taste of the elite. I no longer needed to consume food. For appearances I would eat, yet be forced to vomit it up later. Even the flavor no longer brought me pleasure. The tavern keeper took coins, and it worked to our mutual benefit. I prepared one night to perform, using ash and a feather to highlight my eyes. I peered into a bucket of water to see my reflection, no longer having the priestesses to do it for me, or have access to the expensive mirrors. I felt different now. The more I fed, the more enhanced the world appeared. I could hear better than I could previously, and now could see in near darkness. I went out on stage. My attire changed little, and I beamed at the audience when I noticed a familiar figure seated. Compared to the others, he was still, motionless. The inhuman man had returned. He regarded me for a while, and I didn't want him to take the lives of everyone here. I didn't want them to come to harm, nor to flee yet again. I draped a pallor around my chest, a sign I was not currently working, and decided it was time to approach. The energy that surrounded him was heavy, low, and every step became difficult. I felt like I was walking through heavy sand in order to reach him. I stopped close by. "Who are you? You cannot hurt these people." His gaze did not move from the stage until it finally lifted to look at me. He wasn't human, yet neither was I. Not anymore, I thought to myself. It was a challenge to hold his gaze. He saw deep within me, and I didn't think I could resist him. All he gave me were mental images of me dancing and reaping souls, luring them in, bringing them into my bed to drain them, and leaving nothing but death behind me. In these images, though, I was different, a monster. I jumped back from him, terrified.
"It is time you dance for me instead."
His voice low, a command that could not be ignored. "I don't want to kill. I serve her instead," I whispered harshly in return, still loyal to the goddess who had forsaken me.
"The choice is no longer yours. You haven't noticed yet, have you?"
He gestured around the busy room. The people were wrapped in their lives, loudly enjoying the entertainment provided. The tavern keeper hobbled along, hunched over, his hair grey and skin-lined with age. His children were now adults, each of them working, and I couldn't understand how I didn't notice previously. They aged while I remained the same.
"Time for you to move on,"
he commanded and disappeared, leaving me alone. I reached up and caressed my cheek, still smooth and without change. Out of fear something could happen, I hurried to my room, gathered up my belongings, and bundled them all together. I looked out at the family, my family, the people who mattered so much to me, and gave me refuge without asking me to compromise myself one single time, and walked out into the night. I could see clearly, without the need for a flame torch to light my way. I traveled out to a secluded area away from civilization in defiance, determined to live without his command, and found I was growing weaker, away from my source of nourishment. My skin began to sag, and exhaustion hit me. Deep down, I knew I needed to feed, or else I would perish. Would I starve and die? Or would I continue to linger until I ceased to be? I made my way to one of the larger cities, danced for strangers, and drained them of their life essence, until they passed out. I liberated them of their coin purse and riches as I made my way. I spent some time in the local bathhouse, and listened absent-mindedly while the bath girl ran her hands over my body. Her skilled hands worked their magic, while she gossiped to me about the local community, which nobleman was caught in the bed of another's wife, which wives were more interested in each other's affections, and which noblemen preferred to hunt each other rather than the deer that surrounded the city. One particular note of interest was a party held by a nobleman who, according to the bath girl, had a lustful reputation. Many guests would be in attendance, clean, perfumed, and better dressed than I had been in months. I made my way to the home. My pallor draped around my shoulders, neck, and head, and it concealed my body from view. Confidence and charm opened many doors, and on occasion, legs. The doors were open for me. I closed my eyes in bliss at the sound of the music. I entered, and there were many bare-chested dancers on the stage. Seeing the erotic movements and the yearning of the audience, it made me eager to return to the stage I had come from. My heart jumped when I saw the familiar sight of one of the priestesses, the veil exposing only her mouth. Her hands guided another bare-chested dancer up on stage. She fidgeted and looked at the priestess for guidance. Did I look the same when I first started? It brought back so many feelings of nostalgia, the lure of the stage. I helped myself to a goblet of wine, sipped the liquid, and watched the performance begin. The music began, as did the dancing. She swayed her hips, slowly at first and then more intensely. It answered a question I had. Around me, the life essence of the guests slowly left their bodies and made their way to the dancing girl. She jumped, continued dancing, and I knew she must be a new recruit. I don't know why I decided on this course of action. Mentally, I imagined all the life forces coming to my direction instead, and as soon as the first one entered me, I moaned in remembrance. One by one, they were diverted to me. The smoke came to me. I noticed the priestess's alarm from across the room, and the memory of her hostile superior returned.
Do it. Take them all.
The low, voiceless growl called out, and none around me seemed to hear it. All the viewers were mesmerized by the dancers. I drew the souls inside me, feeding again and practically gorging myself. The priestess stormed toward me, furious, and with her fist raised to strike at me, a bold action for an order devoted to secrecy. I turned toward her, my gaze met hers and sucked inward. Her life force nearly left her body, before being drawn back inside, safe from me. An alternative needed to be discovered. I entered her mind, unknowingly, and it was filled with panic. She cried out for mercy and protection of her goddess, yet none came. She screamed at me to leave. I took control. I forced her hand to reach up to her throat, the whites of her eyes visible, and I twisted on one of the rings to show a stiletto blade, ready to strike. She shook her head. In a graceful, near tranquil moment, she drew it along her throat, once, twice, and a third time. I gazed down at my handiwork, held her close to me, our bodies touching, and I ran my finger down her cheek. I saw my reflection in her eyes, my true one. My skin was red, as though painted with the blood of 1,000 victims. 2 large horns protruded from my skull, and yellow cat-like eyes gazed back at me. Was this my new form now? I placed a soft kiss on her lips, and allowed her body to float down to the floor, our feet coated in blood. None of the audience changed. The dancing and music loomed around us. None even bothered to see what happened to the priestess. I started to feed once more, the euphoria of their souls entering me, filling me, near causing a climax of enjoyment. The crowd withered around me, aging faster than nature commanded. and turned into the decayed remains I was used to seeing. I didn't feel guilt the same way I had before. They all slumped or fell where they stood, dead and well beyond life. There was one sole survivor, the dancing girl. In an alternative universe, she could have been me, afraid and unsure. She looked around and let out a scream. Her eyes locked on me, and I was sure she saw my true form. I could sense she wished to flee, to get to safety, and yet remained on the spot. I approached her, tilted her head up by the chin, and kissed her trembling lips, not wishing to continue her suffering. I parted the kiss. My hand cupped her cheeks, and her life passed to me through them. I held her as she died, our breasts pressed together, and her head lay limp. I lowered down, lay her head gently on the floor, and heard a slow, near-mocking clap.
I have waited for your arrival.
The devil stood, his physical appearance substituted with another, and I judged him by the clothing. The use of silk and gold told me he was a nobleman of some kind, perhaps in the disguise of the host of the celebrations. I heard strange, mystical chanting in a tongue I did not recognize once more. Unlike the unnamed goddess, this one was deeper and more menacing. My hips dropped and swayed. My clothing fell to the ground, and I felt markings slowly burning into my flesh. The devil, as I later discovered he was, sat on a throne made from the wings of broken angels and the flesh of the conquered. The Lord of Doom was flanked by 2 skeletons on either side. With the blood of the dead, my hands slowly circled, my hips swayed, and my body wreathed with the music, and thus I danced for the devil for the first time. My story does not end there. My names or aliases I've been called are many, lost to time, whispered in the most secret of places, now associated with the mysteries pertaining to lust. Throughout the broken history of the world, I continue to seek out large group of patrons to dance for. Some dances more erotic in nature. The title of what I do has changed considerably. Dancer, entertainer, courtesan. Dabbling on the sides of society, the dance has changed, still with the same allure of sexuality to draw them in, and I could conceal myself while I danced, with only the reflections deceiving them. The modern age allows me to say it is a filter or a trick. Besides, it is our time now. I hope you enjoy this story. What did you think of it? Let me know what you thought in the comments section down below. Don't forget to stab the like button, subscribe, hit the bell and leave a comment. This video is made with the support of my incredible channel members, Patreon subscribers, and all my viewers. Thank you so much for supporting me. Don't forget to check out my social media accounts below, including my merch. Stay safe, my little spooklings. And remember, I'll be watching you.